Welcome, welcome. Step through the door if you dare. Candles flicker in the dark, shadows crawl along the walls. Echoes of 1,000 screams drift through haunted halls. Cold breath on your trembling skin, the night has come to claim ya. Every fear's a patient here, inside Dr. Grave's chamber. Welcome to the Chamber of Horrors!
I remember the invitation like it was a page torn from someone else's life. No return address, just a set of directions that took us farther out than anyone usually goes. I drove that night because my cousin asked me to come. "It'll be something different," she said. I didn't know then how different would feel like a bruise. We arrived just before midnight. The house sat back from the road like a secret. Too big, too quiet, windows like blank eyes. A man at the door, who was a little taller than a usual man, should be around 7 feet. Shook my hand the way people who are used to being obeyed shake hands. Polite but precise. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You'll start at 12, he said to the singer when she arrived, quietly, as if that was all anyone needed to know. "And whatever happens, don't stop." She laughed. She was older than I expected. Not old, but her face had the kind of lines that belonged to someone who'd spent their life knowing the price of a song. Her voice, when she started, sounded like an old radio warming up. It filled the room, warm at first, familiar, and then something else. Not wrong exactly, just heavy, like the notes held on for longer than they should. At first, everyone listened. Cocktails halted halfway to lips. Conversations folded away. The clock over the mantel showed 11:59, then 12, and she began the first song. There was a comfort in it for a while. It felt like a private concert at a house that had suddenly become a small theatre. The lighting was soft. The band followed her like they'd been waiting all year for that one breath. Time, though, time felt odd. I checked my watch more than once. The grandfather clock in the hall. It didn't move. I joked about it to my cousin, but she didn't laugh. She had that look people get when they try to hold onto something they can't name. 3 hours went by. Not like when you loose yourself for a few songs and look up, and the night is gone. These were long, layered hours. At some point after the second set, her voice began to crack on the edges. She blinked as if a wind had brushed her face. I saw it then. People's movements were slowing, like film footage dragging. A guest at the far table raised his glass, and the glass hung in the air as if suspended by thread. And then they began to move, not dancing, not swaying. It was creepy. They moved like they'd been pulled by strings, tied to places that didn't belong to them. Their smiles widened past anything human. Their eyelids did things they shouldn't. I could see the whites. I could see the fear in the singer's hands when she glanced over the stage and met my eyes. She mouthed something. Maybe help. Maybe don't stop. I can't say. The host's lips never moved. He just watched. We heard it then, like a thing that crawled under the floorboards. Voices. Thin, layered, coming from the walls or the rafters or the space between heartbeats. They said the same thing, low and precise. "Don't stop singing." She tried to stop. My ears remember the way her voice faltered, a single note wobbling and then catching. The temperature in the room dropped, suddenly, painfully, and the lights flickered. Soft shadows throwing faces into sharper lines. Every time she hesitated, the whispering grew louder, and you could feel the room press in. At precisely 3 a.m, I checked the mantle clock because I had to. Everything changed. Like someone snapped a string, all motion halted. For the barest second, there was a silence so full it pressed on my chest. Then, like a breath sucked into nothing, they were gone. One heartbeat, and then the chairs were empty, the glasses upright. The music stopped mid-note. No scream, no collapse, no mess. They simply weren't there. The host, the guests, the people who had been laughing and talking and raising their hands, gone. In a second, I walked through the hall after sunrise because we were told to wait and scared the stage was empty except for her. She sat on the edge, hands in her lap, still holding the microphone like it weighed a lifetime. She was alive, but she looked as if someone had scraped color from her. Her mouth opened once as if to sing and then closed. She didn't speak for days. She tried to hum in the beginning, and her body convulsed like she'd been shocked. After that night, she never sang again. Doctors said there was nothing wrong they could find. Her lungs were clear, her throat was fine, but every time she tried, her whole face turned like someone trying to force water out of a dry stone. She would whisper in the night, "They're still listening," and then stare at the window until morning. A few months later, she died in her sleep. Quiet. No cause anyone could name. The house. People tried to find it again. Neighbors, journalists, a couple of men with cameras. But the road out there led to fields, to nothing, as if the map had been altered. I tell you this because I was there, because I watched the clock hit 3, because I heard the voices. I have never been inside a room like that since. I have never heard a song without thinking of the way a melody can become a command. So if one night you find an invitation with no address and a line that says, "Arrive before midnight," throw it away. If you see a singer begin at 12 and the host leans in and says, "Do not stop, remember me."
I used to think the world only knew me as the woman with a battered coat and a violin nobody wanted to hear. And maybe that was true, but the violin was the only piece of myself I ever trusted to speak. When I held it, I could forget the hard palms and the coins that never came, and for a few small moments I felt like someone who belonged to sound instead of silence. One night, too far from the city for any light to find me and late enough that even the moon seemed tired, I walked until my feet screamed and my breath steamed in the cold, and when I found a little broken shelter under a leaning roof, I sat down like a thirsty person, finding water, and laid my violin at my side, closing my eyes, as if sleep could stitch me together again. I dozed or the night simply folded me in, and when I woke, the air had changed, the wind had a voice, and a scrap of yellow paper slapped my cheek and fell into my hands. It was sheet music, edges frayed as if it had come from under the earth itself, and the notes were not like the songs my mother or the city taught me. There were odd marks and crooked rhythms I could not name, but something in me warmed at the sight as if I had been given a map to a place I had always wanted to go. I should have put it down. I should have walked away to the road and kept my violin quiet like a secret. Instead, I lifted the bow and let the first note come, because even afraid my hands remember better than my mind, and the sound that rose did not belong only to the wood or the string. It seemed to pull at the dark, to make the trees draw closer with their branches, to make the air itself listen. With every stroke, the tune felt wrong and right at the same time, like a memory I had not lived, and I told myself it was art or madness or both. I told myself anything to keep my fingers moving. The wind died as if someone had put their palm to the night, and in that stillness, the smell came. Damp earth, old leaves, something rotting like apples left too long. I blinked and realized I had been sleeping at the edge of a graveyard, not a roadside shelter. The bench and the crooked roof were a forgotten gate, and behind them stones stood in rows like tired sentries. The paper trembled in my hand. I remember the way the moon cut the ink into thin, pale knives. My heart wanted me to walk away then, but the music had a hold on me that was softer and firmer than fear, and my hands, traitors to good sense, kept playing. The melody climbed and fell, and when I reached the last phrase, it stretched and stretched until it hung in the air like a bell, and then the ground answered with a sound that was not a sound anyone living should hear. The soil cracked, thin and dry, and something pushed up through as if the earth wanted to cough. At first there was a slow, shameful rustle, then a steady tearing, then hands, pale, dirty, the skin hanging like loose cloth, breaking the brown blanket and clawing at the night. Bodies followed, each one more wrong than the last. Heads that tilted the wrong way, mouths open but not for breath, eyes like the emptiness of wells. They rose and stood like statues that forgot to be still, and they looked at me as if I were the one who had kept them waiting. For a moment, I felt the fierce heat of foolishness, of curiosity, because the mind has a way of bargaining even after the heart knows the truth. Perhaps they would only listen. Perhaps they would sway. Perhaps they would smile. But their faces were not faces of music. They were hollow, and when they moved their mouths, a sound came that matched the last note I had played. Low, hungry, a chorus that fit the crooked tune as if it had always lived inside it. Then memory, like a slow rain, filled me. Whispers from the market, old women with their heads tied, children told to step closer when the stores closed. A graveyard once alive with fiddlers and strange worship, burned by frightened hands because people believed music had opened doors it should not open, and then sealed because fear needs a lock. I had finished that song. I had given the dead their key. I did not think. I ran, not because running saved you in stories, but because the body knows when to obey the oldest law. Move. I left my violin where it had fallen, left the sheet music fluttering like a pale wing on the dirt, and I ran barefoot down the road until my legs were jelly and the cold bit through to the bone. I ran until the sound of the singing faded into small, far things I could pretend were wind. After that night, I folded that memory like a sharp blade and hid it away. I never touched my violin in a real way again, not because I hated music, but because I could no longer be sure which notes belonged to me and which belonged to other mouths. Sometimes when the wind is thin and the street is empty and the city sleeps with its windows shut, I think I hear a single crooked phrase carried on the air, and my fingers ache with the ghost of holding a bow, and a woman who used to be braver than her caution tells me stories of the dead that listen for songs. But I have learned to live with silence in my hands, and when the moon is high, I press my palms together so hard that the skin squeaks, and I tell myself a new story, that some doors once open must be left closed forever, and that sometimes the only way to stay alive is to keep your music to yourself, that the place was an old graveyard sealed by fear and fire, that was closed due to curse long ago, and they used to play music for devils. Villagers had burned the gatherings and left the stones to whisper, and the music.
My truck broke down just before sunset, and at first, it didn't feel serious, just bad luck on a lonely road. One moment I was driving carefully through the mountains, and the next, my wheels slipped with a wet splash and sank deep into thick mud. The engine shook, coughed, and then went completely quiet. No signal, no nearby houses, no passing cars, only fog drifting between dark trees and the cold smell of wet earth. I hit the steering wheel in frustration and whispered, "Perfect," to no one. After putting on my jacket and grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside. The air felt strangely cold, sharper than it should have been. In the distance, through the fog, I noticed a few weak lantern lights. It looked like a small village, old and forgotten, with wooden houses, stone wells, and dirt roads that seemed frozen in another time, like something from the 1850s. Hoping someone there could help me find a mechanic, I started walking toward it. When I entered the village, everything seemed normal at first, but something felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Men were fixing broken carts, women were hanging clothes, and children were running and laughing. It looked peaceful, like time had stopped here years ago and never moved again. The people noticed me and smiled politely, but none of them spoke. Not a single word. I told myself that some remote places were just quiet like that. Trying not to think too much about it, I walked up to an old man sitting on a bench and asked if there was a mechanic nearby. He looked at me for a long moment, smiled slowly, and pointed toward the far end of the village. He didn't say anything, no sound, no explanation, just that empty smile. I thanked him and continued walking, even though a strange feeling settled in my chest. As I moved deeper into the village, I noticed something unusual. Every house had a piano. Some were inside near windows, others stood outside under small wooden roofs. All of them were old and dusty, as if they had not been touched in years. I couldn't understand why a small village would need so many pianos. While I was thinking about it, the sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains. Shadows stretched across the road, the air grew colder, and then everything changed. The moment darkness arrived, the village went silent. Laughter stopped. Talking ended. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. People froze where they were standing like statues. Then all at once they turned their heads toward the center of the village. A deep bell rang somewhere in the darkness. I never saw who rang it. After that sound, the people began to move again, but not like before. Their steps were slow and uneven, their arms lifted stiffly, their legs dragged across the ground. They walked like puppets being controlled by invisible strings, and they all moved toward the pianos. I hid behind a broken cart, my heart pounding so loudly I thought they might hear it. One by one, they sat down in front of the instruments, old men, young women, even children. Their eyes were empty, and their smiles looked forced, like masks. Then they started to play. What came out was not music. It was pain. The sounds crashed into each other. High notes screamed like someone crying. Low notes growled like thunder underground. It felt like the noise was cutting into my head and twisting my stomach. My teeth hurt. My hands shook. Still, they kept smiling while they played. Their fingers bent in strange ways. Some cracked, some started bleeding, but no one stopped. In the middle of the village stood a stone statue I had not noticed before. It was tall and twisted, with no eyes and no face, only a wide open mouth, frozen in a silent scream. Candles burned around it, dripping dark red wax onto the ground. The people stood up from the pianos and began to chant in broken sounds, moans, whispers, and rough breathing instead of real words. Slowly, they formed a circle and started to dance. Their bodies twisted in impossible ways. Their heads snapped from side to side. They moved like broken dolls, like zombies, like something that was alive but no longer human. I finally understood. During the day, they were normal people. At night, they became offerings, slaves to whatever dark spirit lived in that statue. They worshiped the devil with music and pain. I can hear the devil in their music. I tried to back away quietly, but my foot snapped a twig. The sharp crack echoed through the square. Instantly, everything stopped. Every head turned toward me. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then their smiles grew wider, and they started walking toward me, fast, too fast. Their feet barely touched the ground. Their hands reached out like they were trying to grab my soul. I ran through fog and between houses, past broken pianos and melted candles. The terrible music followed me, echoing inside my head and chest. I slipped down a muddy slope and barely stopped myself from falling. My lungs burned. My legs felt weak. I didn't stop until I saw my truck. It was still there, still stuck, still broken, but it felt safe. I locked myself inside and stayed awake until morning, shaking and listening to every sound. When sunlight finally came, I looked back toward the village. It was gone. No houses, no roads, no people, only empty land, and one thing left behind, a single piano half buried in mud, its keys stained with fresh blood. That morning, my truck started by itself. No repair, no help, no reason. I drove away and never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone on the highway, I hear soft piano music coming from my radio, even when it's turned off. And every time I hear it, I know they are still out there, somewhere in the dark, still playing, still waiting.